go ahead and get started. The project the part of the project that we're working on is a consumer component, and what we ended up calling it is this climate change or plate. One of the things we found as we began working on the project was that there's some degree of uncomfortableness when you speak of climate change per se. So we wanted to approach it in such a way that we gave a nod towards climate change, but for those people who aren't comfortable discussing it from that perspective, you could also think of it as climate variability. So our goals for the consumer component first were to find out what consumers know or believe regarding the relationship between beef and cattle. In order to do this, we went out and did some focus groups because we needed a point to start where we were looking at what consumers know versus what we thought they know. So we went out and did some investigation on that. After that, we needed to develop a curriculum that would bridge the gap between what people think they know and what we think of is really the case. So that was kind of the goal of the curriculum. We also added in things that people didn't know or didn't think about. So one of the things that we found that they really didn't think about when they were selecting beef or other protein foods was what kind of an impact do those foods have on the environment as they make those selections. We also incorporated grazing cap information, and that one of our future goals will be to incorporate more of the research of the project as some of the research results begin to roll in. So our curriculum as it stands today is not static, set in stone, but it will continue to evolve over time as the project continues as well. And then we had to develop the actual education tools that we were going to have our clientele use. And there's quite a few components in here that we'll try and talk about in a little bit. I mentioned we started with the focus groups, and so we held 10 meetings across the state of Oklahoma, and we made them open meetings. We tried to encourage people to come. Some of them had large groups, some of them were fairly small. We talked with all comers, so we had some specific sets of questions that we asked. We recorded the information, their responses, listened to their discussions. Some of the questions were leading in a direction, but were not leading toward an answer. So what we found that when people were considering any kind of protein choice, they still considered beef to be a healthy option. A lot of them, however, had switched to different protein choices, and this may in part be due to medical constraints or instruction from a physician has directed them to eat less red meat, to consume more chicken, eat more fish. They weren't complying with all of them, but they were tending to eat less red meat. Some of them were also concerned with some of the production practices. And what we found at every one of our focus groups was that the controversy over hormone use and antibiotic use in beef cattle was raised. We didn't address this at all. It wasn't part of our project. However, it came up at every single one. So we did end up in the final analysis, we included some of that information because it seemed to be something that was on top of mind for most of the people who attended. Another reason that they gave for consuming less red meat was the cost. The focus groups were taking place during the drought. Beef cattle prices had fallen when the drought first came on, and ranchers were reducing the size of herds, selling animals on. But as that drought progressed and the number of animals that were available to go to market continued to fall, we saw that the beef price also went back up to a higher point than it had been before. And those folks who were buying beef found this to be an issue, so that they would more often than in the past either choose less beef or they would choose a different protein. So they would choose chicken or pork instead of beef that they might have chosen before. One of the things we found, however, that played directly with this project was that they didn't think about the environment at all. It wasn't top of mind when they bought it. They didn't think about when they eat it. So it was just something that we had addressed in the focus groups, and they said, oh yeah, maybe so. So then there would be some concerns with water. There were some questions raised about grass-fed versus grain-fed beef, and some of those kinds of issues. So we felt from those that we had a pretty blank slate to work with when it came to what's the actual impact of beef on the environment. the next steps for this project were to develop the curriculum itself. And you can see on this slide that one of the starting places for us was to discuss the difference between climate and weather and climate normal. All of these were discussed. We used a fact sheet that's been developed and it put into play by two of the cooperators on the project, and that one has received been received very, very well. We then moved into greenhouse gases, because this is one of the issues with climate change and or climate variability, the amount of particular gases. We look primarily at carbon dioxide and methane, of those that go into the atmosphere and trap heat in the environment, causing the environment to warm. This particular slide or graphic that you see on the slide is from EPA, and it gives a very good discussion of what happens as that climate warms. So you see a greater evaporation, which leads to more droughts and wildfires, and some increased precipitation in some places, decreased in others, which is why you're getting the droughts. Some storms are becoming more severe, and those kinds of things. And as we would talk through these, as we were doing the pilots, then most people will nod their heads and say, yes, I can see that happening in the environment. We're hearing stories now about drought in California that's causing wildfires to go crazy. And then they remember the blizzards in the Northeast that were more intense than they had been in the past. Some temperatures in the states where we live are warmer and hotter, and the climate itself, the planet itself, we're coming off another month where we've had record high temperatures for the planet for a particular month. So people are aware that there's something going on. Whether they wanted to call it global warming or climate variability, it didn't really matter from our perspective. What we needed them to understand was that it's going to be impacting producers, and in fact, in the end, it's going to come back and impact them as well. So then we talked about the relationship between beef cattle with the environment. We spent some time looking at the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced by cattle, because one of the things that we had heard from urban areas and on the news and elsewhere was that folks believed that it was the cattle that were causing all the methane to be released, and that if we stopped raising cattle, then that particular problem would be solved. I think we have another slide that shows you the limited impact of cattle on methane production for the planet, so that most of that methane is coming from something else. But cattle definitely do release methane gas. It's one of the processes of their life and survival on the planet. So they're not innocent by any means in this regard, but they're also not the major producers. We then looked at the impact of the environment, or the impact of all of this on the consumer pocketbook, and whoops, not the next slide. So those were the things that we included. This slide does address the issue of how much of the greenhouse gas is actually coming from agriculture in particular, and then you narrow it down and you see fuel combustion is in there with agriculture, land use and forestry are small amounts. Crop production, crop cultivation is going to be a higher amount, and then livestock, out of that entire pie of greenhouse emissions, including carbon dioxide, methane, and all the other greenhouse gases that are involved as well, is only 4.15%. So that the things that we as consumers do, the things that our industries do, are much larger contributors. I'm not trying to eliminate the contribution of livestock. I'm just trying to make it more realistic in the eye of the consumer as to where the biggest problems are. Livestock producers are looking at ways to reduce their production, and we need to look at ways to reduce the production of greenhouse gases in all these other aspects as well. The other thing about this slide is you notice crop cultivation and livestock together add up to probably around 9%. Well, that line is pretty blurry as far as what's what, because we know that there is crop production that is used for animal feed, and so that line is not as distinct as it would look on this pie chart. We also use a lot of tractors and whatnot, so you're going to have fuel combustion going in on that process of producing that fuel, and moving animals from one place to another. When we're talking about beef production, they aren't born, raised, and slaughtered in the next town in all probability. They're probably going to be transported more than once from one site to another during their lifespan. Here you see the impact on the consumer pocketbook, and what we were considering here is that as we've used the drought as the basis for our example, but as the drought initially began in Oklahoma, it went for about a year or two, and then ranchers were aware that they were no longer able to maintain the herd at the level that they had prior to that. The 10 years prior to the onset of the drought had been heavier rain years than we saw definitely during the drought years, but then normal would have been considered normal as well. So we were having a lot more rain. And so the herds may have gotten a little bit higher, but what we saw with the onset of the drought was that the number of cattle were decreased, because there wasn't food, there wasn't water, and able to maintain a herd in a lot of parts of western Oklahoma and western Kansas as well. And so those cattle were either sold to another part of the country or they were sent to market. But the number of cattle there went down, and the number that went to market went up. And as that glut of beef went on to market, the prices of beef in the market went down. And so consumers had been used to paying one amount, now found that it costs less. So how could this possibly be a problem? Until the amount of excess cattle disappeared from the market, and you're left with a lower amount. So by supply and demand, the price of what's left is going to cost more. And in this case, it costs substantially more. And so a lot of our clientele were reflecting that as they did the focus groups. Well, I'm not going to eat as much beef. I still like beef. I still think it's nutritious, but I can't afford it anymore. And so one of our goals was to look at ways to help them adapt to changing markets, while part of the efforts of the agriculture side of the Grazing Cat Project are to look at ways to help farmers adapt to changing climate and to changing situations. So higher beef prices, less people bought it, less people ate as much of it as they had prior to that. So some things we looked at as far as recommending ways to adapt to those higher prices. One of the first ones was eat the recommended amount. When you talk to a lot of folks, they have an understanding of what the amount of meat they're supposed to eat is during a sitting. So a meal should be 2 to 3 ounces of cooked meat, but they will also tell you that's nothing. And when I sit down to that, it's just like a little snack. It's not like dinner. So we were looking at ways to help people incorporate that concept of eating less, but eating it well. And so we looked at things like incorporating other foods with it. So you see the picture there, you have a stir fry where you still have the meat in there, but it's cut in smaller portions, and you have a lot of some of the things that at least we in Oklahoma don't get enough of, and that would be produce. We're dead last in getting the amount of fruits and vegetables that we need in a day. So this actually has 2 benefits. It helps decrease the amount of meat they are supposed to eat, get it down to the appropriate level, while increasing the amount of some of those foods that we don't eat enough of. Some of the advantages to doing this are also from a nutrition standpoint. The curriculum goes over the nutrition benefits of beef, but it also does the flip. If you're eating a 3-ounce serving, then you're getting its lean beef. You're probably getting around 150 calories, and you're getting about 10 grams of fat. If you eat twice that much, so you're eating 6 ounces, then you're going to be getting 300 calories, and you're going to be getting 20 grams of fat. Still well below the amount of fat that's recommended for the day, but it's also an increase that you could get some of that elsewhere. We also wanted to look at how the beef is prepared. So while the beef itself is not going to be high in sodium or that high in fat, many of the ways that our beef is prepared do increase the amount of fat that's there, and also really increase the amount of sodium, particularly when convenience foods are incorporated. They tend to be higher in sodium as well. We also addressed concerns that were associated with health. So we looked at, as we put the curriculum together, we included information on cancer. Now, this wasn't one that came up when we did the focus groups, but it is one that was a major issue at the time we were getting ready to pilot the curriculum. So we added the concerns on cancer and whether or not red meat causes cancer based on the issue that was brought forward by the World Health Organization in 2015 that said processed meats cause cancer and red meat probably causes cancer. So we tried to put in a discussion of how those studies were done, what those studies show, and when they revised their recommendation, they made sure that it was understood that they weren't saying stop eating red meat, that they were not as sure of what they had seen through observational studies as they'd hoped, but that red meat was still a safe thing to consume. We also added things about how to stretch beef dollars, and some of that is, again, in the slide you see where you add other things to it, so your 2 to 3 ounces goes further. And so we talked about stir fries, we talked about casseroles, we talked about soups, we talked about stews, we talked about pot roasts, and all those kinds of things where you see additional food ingredients added in to help the dollar go farther. And here's if a little is good, a lot is better. The tray that you see there, or the platter that you see there, is about a 15-inch platter. So you can see that the amount of meat was fairly hefty, and the things that were served with it didn't make it necessarily a better nutrition choice. There's a refined carbohydrates in the form of rice and a potato. Then you see some plantains that were fried and cheese on the side. So we needed to look at ways to make the food that we're offering more helpful on a regular basis. This might be okay once in a while, but it's not the way that we should eat on a regular basis. So does eating beef cause cancer? As I mentioned, the World Health Organization made the announcement that they had determined that there was a connection between processed meats and red meats and cancer. They had used observational studies as opposed to using a controlled study, so their information was different than what we would like to see as before we make health pronunciations. They also failed to address the magnitude of risk. So if I eat beef every day, is my risk different than if I eat beef 2 or 3 times a week? And they didn't address that either. They also didn't really break out lean meat versus just beef total. So there was a lot left to be determined before they went over the top and made recommendations that people stop eating meat. So they did do another release that indicated that that's not what they meant, that you could still go ahead and eat red meat. We also looked at hormones, added hormones during production. These were the hormones and the antibiotics were the 2 things that caused a lot of consternation with folks who weren't associated with production. They do have some advantages with production. They do increase growth. They increase feed efficiency, carcass leanness of the animals. And as a result of those things, we know that if an animal is going to come to weight sooner, it's going to need less feed because it's using its feed more efficiently, then it's going to have less of an impact on the environment because of those things. They are regulated by FDA so that they're implanted with small pellets into the ear. They dissolve slowly over 100 to 120 to 150 days. The hormone itself, just small components of it are going to circulate in the blood. It's not like you're injecting it into the blood system. And the amount that actually comes from the injected animals that shows up in the meat later is extremely small. And there are many, many other foods that are way higher in the hormones than an injected animal would be, anywhere from the hundreds of thousands of nanograms, where the injected beef has an average of about 7 nanograms. So it's substantially smaller and probably not of a concern. The ear is not going to go into the food supply, so that even if there are some of the little pellets that haven't completely dissolved, those aren't going into the food supply, and so they will not be an issue. There's not a lag time between the injection and when the animal can go to slaughter. If they wanted to, the content of the hormone in the blood supply would be the same the day after as it is after 100 days or so. So that wasn't an issue. Antibiotics. This was another one that we got quite a bit. And there were 2 questions. One was, and the primary one was, antibiotic-resistant microorganisms, the development of those. The other one was whether or not we're just blanket treating animals to prevent disease. And so what we know from talking with producers is that the antibiotics are used to help animals that are sick or that are really apt to become sick. So if there's an illness going through a herd where that illness is contagious and is apt to spread through the herd very, very quickly, then an antibiotic may be given over a wider scale. If you have one animal who's sick and the likelihood that the rest of the herd is not going to be infected, then only that one animal will most likely be treated. There's not a need to spend the money to treat the rest of the animals in that herd. It is used primarily as a way to make sure that the animals stay healthy. The antibiotic resistance is another concern, however, and here we do have some issues because the animals themselves harbor some of the types of microorganisms that can cause human illness as well, such as E. coli or Salmonella, Campylobacter, and some of those kinds of things. We don't want an microorganism to become so adapted to an antibiotic that it is no longer responsive when that antibiotic is given when there's illness either in the animal or in human. So that's where the focus of interest is on those, and I really don't have a good answer as to what the status of that is at this point. I can tell you that the regulations on how antibiotics are used in animals is going to be tightened up and changed somewhat come January 1st, that the regulations will require a vet to be present as opposed to, and make the determination the antibiotic is required, as opposed to the farmer or rancher being able to get the antibiotic and then administer it themselves. So that may make some situations more expensive for producers, and it may make it more difficult because there aren't as many large animal vets out there to assist in that process as may be needed. So there may be some slowdown in availability and some changes coming in that regard too. So how much do you eat? If you think about your last meal that contained beef, how much of that meat was there? Is it the steak and potatoes like you see on the slide? Was it the 2 to 3 ounce serving? If it's more than the 2 to 3 ounces cooked, then there are some things that may be able to convince you that you need less. If the nutrition talk earlier on didn't do it, you can reduce your food bill if you eat the amount that's recommended. 2 to 3 ounces is a lot less, and so it's going to cost you a lot less. The protein on your plate is going to be one of the more expensive components there, so if you're choosing less of that protein component, you can reduce your food bill. Another thing we often see with protein foods as well as the rest of the food on the plate is that part or big parts of it are wasted, depending on who's eating, whether you came up with a clean plate club like I did, where if it's on your plate, you're supposed to eat it, which has its own nutritional issues later on, or whether you are eating till you're full, in which case you're probably not eating very fast, or you are just eating what you like. So there are all these things that come into play, but we know that large amounts of food are wasted every day. So if you can reduce the amount of food that you're preparing, then you can also reduce the amount of food waste, which in turn has a benefit to the environment, because one of our big places where we find methane being produced by consumers is the food that's being trashed. So additional ways to cut costs. If you're going to look at cutting your food bill, one of the key things that we address in the curriculum is how you buy beef. Most people go into the store and they look for either, they come with a list, they know what's on sale, or they go in and they look at the counter, at the meat counter, and they find out what's least expensive if they're trying to save money, or they just go in, they get what they want, and they pay whatever the price is. If you're one of those people that goes in and you buy it by price per pound, I'd like to offer you another alternative, and that's buying beef by price per serving. And you can see here that we have an example with 3 different cuts of meat. All of them cost $5 a pound, but you don't get the same yield from all 3. Some of them have a bone, some of them have higher amounts of connective tissue, some of them have higher amounts of fat that's going to be dripping off during the heating process, and so you're going to lose it. So if you look at ground beef, we can expect to get 3 or 4 servings, 4 3-ounce servings off of a pound of ground beef when it's cooked. So if we divide the $5 by 4, it's going to cost us $1.25 a serving. When you look at stew meat, you're only going to get 3, so that's $1.67 a serving. And if you look at something like a cross rib roast, then you're only going to get 2 servings a pound, so that a serving, while the meat originally cost the same amount per pound, by the time you're sitting at the table and serving it to your family or your friends, it's costing $2.50 a serving. That's a substantial difference between those. So that's one way that you can look at reducing the amount or the cost when you're looking at buying meat. You can also look at different cooking methods. Very often what we see happens is that when the cost of meat goes up, then we look for other alternatives. Some people look for other kinds of meat. Other people look for other cuts that are less expensive. So they'll look and say, well, this cut is, $12 a pound. I can no longer buy that, but this one's only $5 a pound, but I've never cooked it before and I don't know how to cook it. These days, many people have a phone and they can look up recipes just by pressing a couple of buttons, but it's handy to know how this works. So we gave one of the handouts that we include with the curriculum is an overview of the different cooking methods, helping people understand why one dry cooking method is better for one cut, a moist heat method is better for another cut, and what those two mean, and what kinds of cooking methods. Is broiling dry or moist? Is cooking in an oven bag dry or moist? So we tried to go over that. Is deep fat frying dry or moist? It has a lot of liquid stuff in there, but it's actually a dry heat method, so you wouldn't want to use it for cuts that require a moist heat method for in order to become tender. We also address things like marinating and how that can be used, what ingredients are often used in marinade, and why it works. We then wanted to help consumers consider ways that they could reduce the amount of impact that they themselves have on the environment beyond just the idea of bringing my water in a bottle or recycling, those kinds of things. So what are some of the additional steps that they could take with food in order to reduce their own footprint on the environment? Trying to bring this back from we're looking at initially looking at what cattle contribute to the environment to how the consumer can take another step beyond just giving up beef if that's what their approach is to it, the beef being the one component that's causing all the greenhouse gases. Hopefully they've learned by now that that's not the case, but we want to make sure that they have some different ways that they can do as well. This slide talks about the 2 cooking methods and the parts of the animal that those come from. We also address the issue of using convenience food wisely. It's difficult to get around using some degree of convenience foods, and there's no need to. But when you're using convenience foods, it becomes very important that you read labels to make healthy choices. The fact that one recipe, while it may be higher in fat, higher in protein, higher in calories, higher in whatever it is they're trying to watch or increase or decrease, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the better choice for every day, and how you can balance that out for the rest of the day by making wise choices there. This slide looks at that. From a quick look at the 2 slides, most folks would tell you that the one on the right with 340 calories, it's obviously a better choice because it's got fewer calories, whereas the one on the left has higher calorie content. But when you look down further, you can find the sodium content between the two is different as well. So the one on the right's got more sodium. It also has a higher sugar content. It's got more vitamin A. It's got more vitamin C. So the bottom line here is not that one is good and one is bad. It's you have to look at more than just that one meal as you make your decisions to choose one food versus another. We spent the last bit of our time looking at, in our curriculum, at reducing food waste. The amount of food that's wasted then going into landfills. This doesn't mean consumers are wasting 30 or 40%, but in the process of production, processing, and so on, 30 to 40% of the U.S. food supply does get wasted. That's a lot of product that's being thrown away, increasing the probability that we have methane and other greenhouse gases going into the environment. It also means that we spent a lot of money on resources and impacted the environment in ways that we maybe didn't need to if we had tried to control that down to a level where we were not going to have that much waste. It also means there's a lot of people that aren't getting fed that perhaps could have been fed. Lessons were put into 3 formats. We had a long format where people would come in and listen to the whole thing. It usually took about an hour or a little bit longer. They heard everything that we had to say in that one time. This works well for county educators or county agents in areas where they have trouble getting people to come back for repeat lessons, or if distances are far, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, there's less opportunity to reinforce the information. The other approach we took was a 3-lesson series where we gave everything that we gave in the long lesson, but we broke it up into 3 parts. So there was a review, a reintroduction of some of the material, and then a reinforcement of the material as the lesson sequence progressed, so that we hopefully are doing our research project. The evaluation component will be looking at, in part, whether or not one of those methods is better than the other. We'll continue to offer both, but do clientele learn more over the short period or over the longer exposure? So we've now piloted our project. We've piloted the 20-minute sessions or the 3-lesson series. We've also piloted the long lesson series. We took them all out to pilot across the state of Oklahoma. We also piloted with the county educators here in Kansas today when we did training here. All the lessons include a teacher guide, a PowerPoint presentation, handouts for the educators to choose from, a recipe source if they want to reinforce the message that they're giving by providing a sample, a tasting sample, or do a demonstration. They also have some other suggested activities such as discussion questions, and then we also included an evaluation tool with all of them. One of the things we found out is that they all took longer than we thought they would. I thought we were going out with a 3-lesson series. They'd each take 15 minutes, and they all took longer than that. It was very difficult to get people to come out to 3 complete lessons. We had some people that would come to 1 or 2, and then a whole other person that would come to the 3rd one. So we had some variation in exposure there. We did also decide that it would be very useful if some of these lessons were team taught, either working with a local county educator when we're discussing some of the animal science factors, or if we're talking about one issue that is more cooking oriented, if the county educator or agent isn't as comfortable in that, then bringing in additional resources such as a school teacher or a dietitian who could be able to address some of those kinds of things. And I also found out that over time that if I was going to offer them a sample of the food we were going, it worked much better if I gave it to them at the front of the lesson than at the back. Some people had to leave before we were done, so they didn't get the sample. A lot of times there was some lag time while we were waiting for some folks to show up, and so using the time in that way kind of got them focused. I'd like to now introduce Jessica Moore, who is the graduate research assistant who's been helping us with the project. She's in charge of entering data and eventually coming out with a thesis on what we found while we were doing those focus groups. So Jessica, you want to take it over?
Hi, good afternoon. So I will be talking mainly about the evaluations and kind of the logistics of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how. We are doing a retrospective pre-post evaluation, and the reason we chose this one is because it works to eliminate that response shift bias that we looked at, and that's when consumers overestimate what they know before the lesson, but after the lesson when they're aware of the material, they underestimate a little bit. So in that effort, we were hoping to eliminate that bias that could be included. But we did, like she said, the first lesson, we did 3 lessons, and then we did, for the first lesson, there was going to be 6 questions to the evaluation, and then lesson 2 and 3 has 5 questions each. And we have been piloting these in the curriculum, and we're doing these changes. So with each of these evaluations here that you'll see, you'll notice that there's kind of knowledge-based questions and there's behavior-based questions. And the focus on doing that is to kind of help us analyze what the differences are and how different areas are being influenced by this curriculum. And we're also, of course, the individual versus combined presentation. So we do different evaluations. We have each individual, and then we also have the combined. So with this, you can see that we use the 5-point Likert scale, and you can see there at the beginning it says before the lesson I, and then it has whatever usually it's either knowledge or behavior-based question in the center, and then after the lesson. And so the way we're scoring this is we're subtracting the pre-score from the post-score to get kind of a sum score that will be used in chi-square analysis later on. We also, within that, a positive score would obviously indicate a positive increase in knowledge or behavior. Negative would be kind of insignificant, and 0 would just mean that they had the same amount of knowledge walking in and out. So as far as implementation, we've reached about 60 to 80 participants and collected about 105 evaluations from 6 different counties. The reason that is different, that we have collected more evaluations, is obviously the return rate of those individual lessons that we presented. So each time they came back, which is good, having the return rate there. But the counties we presented were Oklahoma, Rogers, Cleveland, Choctaw, McCurtain, and Bryan. And we started this on April 12th, and we're kind of ending here in August. We're hoping to get a few more in here with some educators after the in-service that we had on July 26th in Cleveland County. But the reason also with the 105 evaluations, the reason we kind of originally hoped maybe a little higher, but it does have to be usable. So some of those were invalid, whether it was lack of consent form or this or that. So we've been trying to highly encourage that as well. We also within this have noticed, and we're evaluating demographic behavior as noticed in the previous evaluation at the bottom, but we'll be able to see it again in the 3-month evaluation. And we kind of expected some trends based on the information we were presenting, but we'll kind of talk about that here in a little bit. So as far as the trends that we are seeing, the initial look is definitely presenting positive correlations. Like I said, we've also seen those demographic trends. So we've seen a lot of female participants, which is expected, often the gatekeepers of the household. So those are the ones that, while we talk about these ways to approach purchasing beef in the grocery store, this or that, women are typically the gatekeeper of the household as far as that goes. And then we also saw a lot of rural versus compared to urban, just because, once again, the interest of beef cattle production and the population that this kind of reaches to an interest for right now. Also, we noticed that there was it was 45 and above typically, so we think that also goes back to that gatekeeper and the role and time. As far as the additional contributors and potential recommendations, Dr. Brown kind of hit on that already. Basically just having both the ag and the FCS educators available, and just making sure that is properly presented for the second lesson. So the plan for the 3-month evaluation is we have pre-addressed stamped evaluations, and they'll be mailed out to the participants. In approximately 3 months, we're going to be starting that here pretty soon in the fall. And they're just going to be there to kind of show us what the long-term impacts of this program is. So we initially and have immediately, right after the lesson, presented or sent in these evaluations that I've shown you here. But we are also going to be sending out this 3-month evaluation that I'll have on the next slide. And it kind of is going to be what we are sending out to evaluate the long-term impacts to see if that long-term even had made a difference on some of them. So they are the same questions, but we're wanting to see what has been made over time. And so you can see it's just going to have the after the lesson, and then there at the bottom is the demographic information that I discussed earlier. So you have gender, residence, age, education. And so we haven't, we didn't include income, race, or any of those things. So these are really what we have been focusing on, and we're hoping to see some trends there as well. Also, to note with that is the coding system that is at the top. That's kind of how we will be tracking, or it was it's kind of how we are tracking the participants so that we ensure that we're getting the right evaluations to the right participants. And so we're also looking into ways to make sure which ways would be most effective on collecting those, whether sending them out individually would be more effective or sending them all out at once. We don't know if it may get their attention better, they won't stick together, and they'll notice them if they're sent separately. So we're kind of thinking about those things and evaluating them right now before we send them out. So as far as kind of a summary here, for right now, we have basically completed the piloting of this curriculum in Oklahoma. We're going to be analyzing data. I'm actually going this evening to start working on that. And so we'll be doing just chi-square tests and breaking it up into those knowledge-based and behavior-based questions, and along with evaluating the individual versus combined lesson. And then in the future, like I talked about, we'll be mailing out those 3-month evaluations and be receiving those back hopefully here shortly. And then overall, we're just really, inclusion, we're hoping that with adequate knowledge, consumers will be equipped to make more educated decisions regarding beef purchasing, consumption, preparation, and all of those areas. And then obviously with Extension's help, it's being made possible in Oklahoma and Kansas, hopefully, that we can reach more consumers with this curriculum.
Thank you, Jessica. As we've mentioned a couple of times, we have been training educators, and we've trained educators in Oklahoma in July, and we trained them in Kansas today on how to use the curriculum, how to incorporate it into programs. We offered suggestions. We tried to build as much flexibility into the program as we could by developing the series of 3 lessons, so that after our pilot project, if an educator wanted to use one of the lessons out of the series of 3 and they only wanted to use one of those lessons, that would be okay. We tried to make them so that while we are able to reinforce messages in previous lessons, each lesson, on the other hand, could stand alone and be able to use by itself, either in a situation where you had 15 or 20 minutes is all you have to have. Lessons could also be used because each of the PowerPoint slides that's included for the lessons does include a script, so that they could be used if clubs wanted to use them. You could train the club leaders and then let them go back to the club and do the training for you. So a train-the-trainer setup would work very well. We did them as the 3 short lessons, the 1 long lesson. They'd also be encouraged to use only parts of the curriculum if that in fact was an option. The audiences they go to, we are hoping that they will look and see all the different kinds of groups that they already work with and consider this as one of the teaching tools when they begin to determine what programming will be for those particular audiences. We also talked about expense. Now, the project, when we've done it as pilots, has been covered under the grant funds, and even so, the funds were not excessive in the amount it would cost per lesson. Usually we demonstrated one thing, or we had one thing, one recipe prepped ahead so that it would reinforce the principles that we were teaching in that lesson. However, the lessons can be taught without any sampling done, so the cost would be more limited to if there was a cost for your space or equipment as far as AV equipment, and or whether you wanted to, the other one has eluded me, so there you go, you're only going to get 2. The other thing that is with expense is whether or not you want to charge. If you were going to charge, if you were going to prepare food, if you were going to do it as a workshop where individuals actually came in and did the preparation themselves, you gave them the 15-minute talk and then they did some preparation in 3 or 4 groups and then sampled the food, that would probably be one where you'd want to cover the cost of that food. So we don't have a problem with people charging once the curriculum is gone out to the storage sites where you'll be able to access it. So that's up to the individual county and the individuals as they begin to use the education material. There is some advantage to charging, even if you're only going to not have big expenses, but just charging a small amount, particularly if you're wanting to teach a series of lessons, and that people will sometimes think, well, I paid for all 3, so I better go to all 3, as opposed to I paid for 2 or I paid for 3, or I didn't pay for any of them, so I'm not going to go. The first one was fine, but I just don't want to make the effort, or I don't have a conflict with the other ones. So there is some degree of discussion as to whether that's a benefit, whether your costs are extremely high or not. I'd keep them low. It's not a moneymaker. That's not the intent. It is an educational piece. But on the other hand, budgets are tight everywhere, and if you need to charge to cover the cost, that's okay. Also wanted to remind you who the partners for the Grazing Cap organization are. Oklahoma State University, Kansas State, where I'm speaking to you from today, University of Oklahoma, Tarleton State University in Texas, USDA Ag Research Service, and the Samuel Roberts Noble Foundation. I always want to call it the Sam Roberts Noble Foundation, and so it always throws me. I also encourage you to go to the website for the organization and explore all the fantastic things we have posted there. The curriculum that we developed will be housed there under resources. If you click on resources, it'll drop down a menu and you can click on educators, and we hope to have it in there at some point within September, so you'll be able to access the material that we've got there. There may be some changes in the evaluation tools. There's probably going to be a few more edits in the curriculum itself. Basically, it's pretty much ready to go, so it shouldn't take us too long to get it up and ready for you to use. I want to thank you. Do we have questions?
All right, for those of you who didn't hear the announcement prior to the webinar, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and so you can just click on that and type in your question. Our first question is, you mentioned reducing the food bill by buying less beef in the store. Considering the culture of fast food in Oklahoma and the U.S. in general, where specific food ingredients and the preparation process seem to be less of a concern as opposed to taste, do you think this advocacy strategy can really work there?
Well, I think you can use it in those situations as well. When you go to a fast food place and you buy, the giant hamburger, and then you don't eat it all, it's the same kind of principle. So would you be better off to look at some of the smaller menu choices? We have one that offers the same toppings on a burger, but you get it on the 6-pound burger instead of the 3rd-pound burger. There you're buying less product, you're getting less bun, you're getting less of everything. It's just smaller, and so it's the same kind of thing, you're just using it in a different situation. You can also look at it from the standpoint of when you go out and you buy meat, are you buying it as just a giant piece of meat, or are you incorporating some of those other things in it? So you're looking at stir fries or casseroles and those kinds of things, which are available in many fast food places, as opposed to buying just a single piece of meat.